Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The Tories have been in conclave in Manchester, but no puffs of white smoke identifying the next leader are yet discernible.
Or rather, several chimneys were belching at the same time, in different shades of grey.
Boris Johnson had a good conference. Theresa May, in her new Wonder Woman garb, had a bad one. Gideon Osborne, busy politically cross-dressing, had neither one thing nor the other.
David Cameron painted the Conservatives as the new centre ground and painted the Labour leader as an outlaw living in the forest and painting his face a deep shade of red. It's going to be an interesting few years.
Former Tory Cabinet Minister, the Rt Hon Andrew Mitchell MP, joins us now to review the Tory conference and more. Andrew, the last time you were here, you were hot foot from the aeroplane, just back from Washington, where you'd led a delegation which included the then little-known Jeremy Corbyn, trying to get the British resident of Guantanamo Bay, Shakar Amar, out from unjust imprisonment. First of all, then, did you recognise Jeremy Corbyn from the Prime Minister's description this week?
Well, I don't think that the Prime Minister was trying to describe Jeremy Corbyn. He was making a political point, which, as you know, George, you get at these party conferences. But I did think the Prime Minister made an extraordinary speech, and a very good one, probably the best I've heard him make in the 10 years he's been Conservative Party leader. And I think for those on the left, the way he planted Tory tanks firmly on the ground of social progress and mobility, social mobility, is for the Tory party an inspiring and very important piece of political footwork.
Well, it's very loyal of you, but he did say that Jeremy Corbyn was a Britain-hating, terrorist-loving leader, and neither of those two charges is true, is it?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily have used those words myself, no, but, you know, this is a party conference, a big set-piece annual speech, and you expect a bit of that sort of knockabout in it.
Well, it's the kind of language that in totalitarian countries is used just before the leader of the opposition gets put under arrest.
As far as I know, the government has no plans to follow that pathway.
Did David Cameron make a mistake indicating so early when he would be going? Doesn't that transform every Tory conclave from now on into a kind of hustings?
Well, I don't... well, there's two different aspects to your question. On the issue of whether there will be a degree of hustings at the next conferences, the answer is yes. But as to whether he was right to do it, I rather think he was. And the reason is this. You and I can both remember, George, former prime ministers being eased out and pushed out by their parties. In his case, he's made it clear how long he's going to stay. And I think it gives him not only a greater authority, because he doesn't have to do all that stuff that others had to face, but it also, I think, enables him to control the big beasts within the party more easily, because he's got another couple of reshuffles in his knapsack. And if the big beasts don't behave, don't put their shoulders to the wheel to drive forward the policies which he has set out so clearly in that speech, then he can get rid of them. So actually, I think it gives him greater authority and avoids the problems which some of his predecessors of both parties have had.
Maybe so. I think, as an observer, that it disadvantages George Osborne because it's clear that Mr. Cameron would like to be succeeded by him, but it's also clear that the nexus of power around Cameron in Downing Street is of limited shelf life. So it transforms the other candidates into insurgency and George Osborne, in a sense, as the incumbency. And I thought that was partly reflected in the conference. Somewhat to my surprise, I thought Boris Johnson did really well. You said Cameron's speech was the best he'd made in 10 years. I thought Boris Johnson's speech was the best I'd heard him give.
Yes, it was a very good speech, and of course it anchored Boris firmly in the one nation part of the Conservative Party, which is where he belongs, and it emphasised the success he has had as Mayor of London over the last 8 years, his record of that, and that will help him. But in the end, you know, George, you and I have seen this before. The favourite never wins. Look at what's just happened in the Labour Party. Look at what happened to the Conservative Party. And invariably the favourite never wins.
Several times in the Conservative Party
Yes.
in our time together.
Yes, but
but the favourite is Osborne.
Yes.
And I agree with you. He's not going to win, I don't think.
Well, the favourite never does.
Boris was a more serious character at this conference than he was at the last one.
Otherwise.
He can come across a kind of harumphing hippopotamus. But actually, I thought he was really pretty sharp at this conference.
Yes, I think I agree with that, and I think that the speech that he delivered was a very good speech indeed. I thought actually that George's speech, if you read it particularly, was very strong and good indeed. This decentralisation of power, which both major political parties have sought to do, largely unsuccessfully, I think that's an important part of extending the democratic agenda, democratic accountability particularly. So I thought they were all very good speeches, but I agree with you that Boris's speech was a much more serious speech of a leadership contender than we've perhaps seen in the past.
There's the rub. George Osborne's speech reads better than it sounded and looked. And in this age, once upon a time, politics was all in the reading. Now it's all in the watching and all in the listening. I'm not sure that his kind of desiccated calculating machine type of delivery cuts it in the 21st century.
Well, we'll see. I mean, his shares go up and down with the economy. That is George's great strength. And although you and I would not tend to agree on this, I think he's done a very good job as Chancellor of the Exchequer and as our finance minister. But in the end, his shares in the party go up and down with the economy, and his position at the moment as favourite, if I was him, I would find an uncomfortable position.
Uncomfortable. Theresa May staked out the right-wing ground, didn't she? In her new power stance and power dressing, bashing the European Union more than the others, bashing immigrants more than the others, not sounding too liberal on prison and other legal matters. She's the right-wing candidate. And Osborne and Johnson are fighting in the centre-left. Would that be accurate?
I think that Tory leadership elections are more complex than that. And I often think that, particularly among members of Parliament, it's as much personality that counts as much as policy. I think the problem with Theresa May, who is clearly a very strong contender, is that she appeared, as I understood her speech, to be attacking her own record. And I'm not sure what the purpose of that is. If you get up on stage and say what a mess immigration policy is when you've been in charge of it for 5 years, it's not immediately clear what conclusions you are inviting the audience to reach.
Very shrewdly put. Now let's turn, if we may, to Shakar Amar. You know I have the highest regard for you and your colleague David Davis. Both of you were with Jeremy Corbyn on that very important mission to Washington. You were counterintuitively, some would say, as Conservatives, not particularly left-wing ones, you were standing up for justice. You saw Shakar Amar banged up in Guantanamo Bay without charge, without trial, year after year, long after he'd been cleared, and you've got him out. You must be feeling quite pleased about that.
Well, let's not count the chickens till he's back, but we have, I hope, been successful. We were pretty outspoken when we were there, and as I think we said before in your programme, these were 4 members of Parliament who've been around the block a bit, of very, very different views. In fact, I think I may have said that when we all had dinner together, we found there was nothing we agreed on at all, apart from the importance of getting Shakar Amar out of
That's
Guantanamo.
how it should be, Andrew. That's how it should.
Well, but I think we need to see him back. There are some more hurdles to go through, but the 30-day period has now started. And I think one of the reasons why David Davis and I and others in the Conservative Party think this is such an important issue is that in the end, if you are going to beat the terrorists, if we are going to face down and end the ISIL insurgency, we have got to do it in accordance with the rule of law and show that our values are better than the values that they assert. And for the American government to keep someone in jail for 14 years, who's never seen his own 13-year-old son, to do so in spite of the fact that 2 presidents have specifically cleared him for release, one in 2007 and one in 2009. never charge him is a very serious matter and undermines the principled position that I believe Western democracies should take in these matters. So it's very important indeed that this incarceration is ended. And I also believe it's extremely important that when he is returned to the United Kingdom, he speaks out about what has happened to him and is not silenced by the lawyers or anyone else. That he speaks out about what's happened so that if there are errors and things that have been done wrong in the system, we are able to put them right.
Now, these hurdles you mentioned in getting him back, these are they mostly lie in Washington, yeah?
Yes. Yes, they do. And it's whether or not there's a problem with the Congress about the procedures. But we are very hopeful that he will be back. In that 30-day period, the British government has said that they will be sending a plane to fetch him from Guantanamo. And the sooner he is back here and able to speak straight to the media, not intermediated by anyone else, about the experiences that he has had, we can then address anything that has been done wrong, which the British government or British officials were involved in, and make sure that they are put right so they don't happen again.
Thank you very much, Andrew Mitchell, for coming on board the Sputnik.
Coming up next, it's the scandal that just won't leave the British establishment alone. Mark Watts of Exaro News. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. We featured momentarily in a much criticised edition of the BBC's Panorama last week, but they didn't mean it as a compliment.
The BBC, itself deeply entangled in a child sex abuse scandal, though Panorama didn't put it that way, has been accused of blaming the victims and shooting the messenger.
And the chief messenger on this story is our next guest, the editor-in-chief of Exaro News, Mark Watts. Mark, we stand by our story that you have performed a signal public service with the journalistic campaign that you have run on this big scandal. Do you stand by your story?
We certainly do, bearing in mind that what we've done is reported on evidence, and we've been very careful not to talk about truth of specific allegations or falsity of them, because that's not something that's appropriate when you've got live criminal investigations. But I think one thing that people should be aware of is another very interesting investigation that we only revealed on Monday that was launched last week. And that really lies behind what we're seeing, which is an investigation being conducted by the Met's Professional Standards Directorate into a senior detective who is suspected of leaking the details of at least one abuse complainant to journalists, and is also suspected of briefing, as it were, against Operation Midland, which is the investigation into child sex abuse, torture and murder. Now, we haven't named who that senior detective is, but I think that is going to be one to watch.
Well, a senior police officer leaking to the media would not be a first, but it would be a particularly damaging leak if established, and calls further into question exactly what's going on here. I'll tell you my take. I think it's the public take, that the establishment are terrified of this story. It won't go away. So the best tactic, perhaps the only tactic, is to blame the victims and shoot the messenger.
I think that's what is going on. And just to be clear, that the senior detective who's under investigation has nothing to do with the paedophile unit. He's not working for the paedophile unit. He's not working on Operation Midland. It's someone quite separate. And I think what we're seeing is the media being used, actually, to do exactly what you say, which is to attack abuse survivors. And it's terribly easy to attack abuse survivors because they often are, not always, but often are people with enormous ongoing problems. They may have had convictions. I mean, they generally all have problems, but some of them have convictions. Some of them have had a past of taking drugs and so on. So it's very easy to attack abuse survivors. But what's interesting is very little has been said, and Panorama managed, I think, to say literally nothing about the police officers, the former police officers, who have come forward to claim that past investigations by the police into evidence of child sex abuse by prominent people, including politicians, were closed down. And we have 49 examples where the Met has referred I think that's the right number, 49 referred to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, of which 29 of the Met are being pursued by the IPCC and another 2 police forces elsewhere. So 31 ongoing investigations into claims by former police officers that operations were closed down improperly when they were pursuing evidence of child sex abuse by MPs or other prominent people.
Well, I can assure you Panorama did not find the time to mention that fact because I've studied Panorama frame by frame. I was surprised that the BBC was the suer in choice for this attack.
Exactly, on top of shooting the messenger and blaming the victims,
Considering that many of the alleged and some proven abusers were themselves high-profile employees of the BBC, and considering that the BBC suppressed their own journalists' investigations, which would have unveiled the conduct of Jimmy Savile of the BBC much earlier than was done.
Well, you're right, of course, that the BBC is hardly an independent institution on this matter. But it's also interesting to know that there are lots of journalists at the BBC who are very conscious of this. And I can tell you there is civil war at the BBC over that Panorama. You have civil war effectively between some of the journalists on BBC News as distinct from Panorama. Not least because some of the journalists on BBC News were following some of the big stories that we were doing, particularly on Operation Midland, which is the investigation into child sex abuse, torture and murder. And there's fury. There's fury about what Panorama has done. Because one of the things that Panorama has done, and this is something that the Met here, in an extraordinarily strong statement, issued just as the programme was starting. The Met knew what the Panorama was going to say because, of course, Panorama had put, at some stage, some allegations to them. And they were furious because they regard the approach that Panorama took as deterring other witnesses, particularly abuse survivors, from coming forwards. And I think they talked about it. I wonder if I can just quickly find the reference. What the Met said, and I have to say I completely agree with them, but what the Met said was, we are worried that this programme, Panorama, and other recent reporting, referring to newspaper reports, will deter victims and witnesses from coming forward in future. Seeing an individual make allegations and then be targeted by the media is not going to encourage others to speak out.
There was something a little unseemly about highly paid, powerful journalists kind of bearing down on people who were clearly a bit unsteady on the legs, metaphorically speaking.
Well, especially when they went for them and completely didn't mention the former police officers, because they were perhaps a little bit more difficult to try to discredit, as Panorama set out to do. But I want to tell you something that really brings this home. After the programme, I took a call in the early hours of the morning from an abuse survivor who has come forward and is at the centre of a police investigation, was not even mentioned in the Panorama, who had attempted suicide as a result of that programme. And what that person said to me was, if I hadn't already come forward, after watching that, I wouldn't now. In other words, exactly what the Met said.
Now, apart from the civil wars within the BBC and the media responses, how do you think the public, the public in general, has received this programme?
Well, it's very hard to gauge that, isn't it? I have to say that the programme was a real muddle and a mess. And actually, the consistent message that I've received, and we often, everyone working for Exaro, have all been asking, friends and parents and brothers and sisters who are not too familiar with the story just to get an impression. And most people were totally befuddled. It was a complete muddle, and I don't know, quite frankly, that the public would know what to make of that.
Well, they say a camel is a horse designed by a committee. It looked to me like a programme that had been forced to pull a punch or two here and there, that had been under pressure internally, perhaps as a result of the ructions at the BBC to which you refer. And the reason I watched it twice was I couldn't quite understand what their point was.
Well, you're right, and part of the reason why they would have had to pull the punches from the ones they wanted to strike was because the Solicitor General, Robert Buckland, Conservative MP, issued a warning, a very stark warning, just I think roughly 2 weeks ago, which said that no media should be prejudging active live criminal investigations. So he was stressing that even though there are no court proceedings on these investigations into VIPs, I mean, actually there is one, but he wasn't referring to that one because everyone knows not to report too much about the one that's going through the courts. But in terms of the ones that are just active criminal investigations as opposed to court proceedings, he warned that no one should be reporting anything that prejudges the issue. In other words, no one should be saying it is true, that specific allegations are true, or that specific allegations are false, or that the witnesses are talking nonsense who are subject still to these live criminal investigations. Now, here's the problem. If you title a programme, as Panorama did, What's the Truth? First of all, it was quite obvious that Panorama didn't know what the truth was. But even if you did know, according to the Solicitor General's warning, you shouldn't be saying, because this is active criminal investigation and we have to allow the police and judicial system to work. Now, that's not to say that it's unreasonable to scrutinise what they're doing. I think it is reasonable to do that and to ask questions. I think it's fair enough to sort of ask questions about why did the senior police officer talk about the key witness at the base of Operation Midland being credible and true. I mean, that is fair enough, and you know, our eyebrows raised when that phrase was used. It was perfectly reasonable, in my view, for the police to talk about the witness being credible and his account as being credible. And interestingly, the Met has repeated that just recently in the face of all the false reporting, which seems to have come from the senior detective who's got nothing to do with Operation Midland, who's under investigation, that the claim was that the operation was on the brink of collapse.
Running out of steam, winding down, and so on.
The Met made it clear they've got 27 officers on this case, and they made the point that they would not be doing so, would not be investigating this in this way if they didn't regard the core allegations as being credible.
Credible, yeah. Now, summarise for us where this all now stands. Who's under investigation, not the names, but the kind of people. Are charges already laid against anyone? Are they likely to be laid soon? As far as you're able, within the constraints of professional ethics and the law, just summarise for the viewer where this scandal now stands.
Well, so far, we have had the DPP issue a statement some while ago now, which I don't think also was mentioned in Panorama, about Sir Cyril Smith, who was a Liberal MP, a senior backbencher. And we learned from that DPP statement that there were 3 occasions on which he should have been prosecuted over allegations of child sex abuse. The evidence was strong enough to charge, and yet that did not happen. So that's that. We have the current case that I referred to earlier with Lord Janner, who's a former Labour MP, and he's facing a trial. We expect it to be converted into a trial of the facts because we're really expecting a finding that he's not fit to plead. And what the trial of the facts will do is determine whether the alleged acts, which is, from memory, it's 22 counts of child sex abuse that's alleged, and he does deny the allegations, the court will be charged, as it were, with finding whether the acts were done. And beyond that, we have an incredible number of police investigations up and down the land into prominent people. The one, as I say, that people are most conscious of is Operation Midland, which started as a result of evidence that Exaro first reported. And that is investigating allegations of child sex abuse by a group of very prominent men, including politicians, but not only politicians, as well as murder. Is in fact investigating allegations of 3 murders. In addition to that, we are aware of a former Liberal Democrat MP who is subject to a criminal investigation. We are aware of a serving Labour MP who also is under investigation by the police for child sex abuse. I mean, there are a plethora of investigations into prominent people, and in addition to which we have the IPCC investigations, a plethora of them, into closed operations of the past.
Mark Watts, more power to your elbow. That's what I say.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming on the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, I asked them whether they agreed that David Cameron's attack on Jeremy Corbyn is basically Civil War speech. And Michael Taylor answers, It was done to tease out a reaction from JC so that Cameron can revert to shouting and bullying. Well, that's all that we've got for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us, though, on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik and on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.